Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am absolutely over the moon to be here with Colin Walsh to talk about his incredible novel, Calla. I think it's backwards on my screen. I hope it's not backwards on yours. But anyway, don't read it backwards. Read it front to back. The order of the plot's really important. This incredible novel, which happens to be Barnes& Noble's July pick in paperback, will absolutely enchant you. It will take you away to the village of Kinlock in Ireland when you will meet a very provocative group of three adults who grew out of an incredibly tightly intertwined teenage friendship circle, and all of the drama from their past that comes back, rushing back at them when they confront the fact that one of their number, who went missing in 2003, is what actually happened to her now in the present day. I'm Juliet Grames. I'm the editorial director at Soho Press, where I edit our crime fiction imprint. So this is especially of interest to me as a person who has specialized throughout my career in reading international crime fiction, to be able to be taken away to Ireland on this incredible read. I'm just very excited to talk to you today. Let me tell you a little bit about Colin before I turn the mic over to him. So Colin Walsh's short stories have won several awards, including the RTE Francis McManus Short Story Prize and the Hennessy Literary Award. In 2019, he was named Hennessy New Irish Writer of the Year. His writing has been published in The Stinging Fly, The Irish Times, and broadcast on RTE Radio 1 and BBC Radio 4. Calla is his first novel. He is from Galway and lives in Belgium. Colin, say hi. Are you in Belgium now?
I am. Yeah, yeah. I'm in a kind of rain-swept, sunny, weird, beautiful Belgium. Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being part of the Midday Mystery conversation. It's really exciting to talk to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the world of the novel so we can really dig in?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so yeah, it's set in a fictional West Coast of Ireland tourist town, Kinlock. And there actually is a real Kinlock, but I didn't know that until I'd finished the book. But yeah, it's on the West Coast in the book. It's a fictional tourist town. And yeah, we're following this group of friends as teenagers and as adults. As teenagers, we're really with them for that, the summer of their lives, the time where they're passing through all the classic adolescent thresholds, like the first love, the first kiss, the first time getting drunk. So all that, yeah, giddy, feverish, hormonal magic. And Kala, the title character, is the center of this group of friends. She's 15 years old and she's the leader of this gang. She's like the emotional core of the group. But yeah, to talk a little bit about the place, beneath all the smiling surfaces of this tourist town, there's this kind of broiling darkness that's constantly threatening to swallow these characters, these kids. And as the summer goes on, they're getting closer and closer to that darkness. And by the end of the summer, Kala goes missing. So 15 years later, as you said, we're with three of the surviving members of that original group of friends, who find themselves, yeah, thrown back together when human remains, Kala's remains, are found in the woods, and their past and their present begin to, yeah, dramatically and violently collide. But yeah, we're constantly shifting back and forth between their teenage and adult selves, as the story goes on. So yeah.
Which is really a work of art, the way you've intertwined those two narratives, the past and present. But before we go there, I want to talk about our three prospective characters, these three adults, right? We have Helen, who's an investigative journalist. Now, she's been away from Kinlock for a really long time. You could actually say that she's been estranged from her hometown, right? And then we also have Joe. Joe's a world famous musician, and he's also been away for a very long time. Both of them are back in town now, and they reunite with Mush. Mush has stayed local. He runs a cafe with his mom, and so this is the setup. We get this sort of crucible created by these three very dear old friends who haven't been in touch in a very long time. Um, I, I love that the book is narrated evenly from each of them. I think the characters are so realistically drawn. I feel like I know these people. And I'm
Right.
wondering where did they come from? Where did the story come from?
Um, I mean, I'm not. It's kind of. It's a strange thing where I mean, you would know this as well yourself from just from writing yourself that it's not like it all happens at once, but it does happen in these kind of clusters of ideas where I think if there was a originating image for the book, it was I had an image of a teenage girl sitting on a porch of a house that was at the mouth of the woods, and it was dusk. It was summer and she was smoking a cigarette. And I knew that her grandmother was inside the house. I knew she was waiting for something and that there was some sort of sense of foreboding in the dusk, but also that seductive, sultry kind of summer quality. And I didn't know at the time that this girl was Kala. But already, just from that image alone, I already had, like the setting, the vibe, like the whole
Mhm.
emotional color of the thing. And then from that point, it sort of evolved. I knew that I knew already that I would be writing around her as opposed to from her perspective, that she would be someone that was being looked at by the narrators, and that you were getting different points of view on her. And I guess one of the big influences for me with that was there's this famous essay from 1965, I think, by Gay Talese, where Esquire wanted him to interview Frank Sinatra, and he showed up at Sinatra's hotel in Miami, I think it was, and he was like talking to Sinatra's bodyguard, and he said, "No, Mr. Sinatra has a cold." And then the next day, he talked to Sinatra's mother, and she said, "Oh yeah, Frank has a cold." And then he just kept trying to get to Sinatra through all these different people, like the fans that were hanging out in the hotel, the security guards, the woman who looked after Sinatra's toupee. So all of these different angles, and he couldn't get to him. But what he noticed was that with each person he talked to, he was getting a very different version of Sinatra. They would all portray Sinatra in this slightly different way. To some people, he was this really kind, kind of gentle figure. To others, he was this monster, the kind of person that you'd cross the street to avoid. He could be very charming, he could be very charming, he could be very brutal. And the thing is that he realized this is the meat of the story. This is actually so much richer than if I had a direct line to Sinatra himself. I'll just weave a kind of mosaic of all these points of view of Sinatra, and then through that, I'll have a much richer version of Sinatra than I would have if I was just speaking to the man himself. And that, structurally speaking, Kala she is the Sinatra of the novel. You're getting all of these points of view on her. And my hope is that the kind of the gaps or the spaces or the inconsistencies between the view of Kala that you're getting from the three narrators will kind of open spaces for you as a reader to enter the book and actually try and decipher who is the real Kala amongst these people. So to try and see what is being missed, because crucially the narrators, there are many things that they crucially don't see or cannot recognize about Kala because of their own desires, their own relationship to her, their own jealousies or fears or love, or so that was kind of that was a sort of starting point, was that sort of structural thing.
I'm so glad you told the Gay Talese story. That's such a I love that inspiration for the character and that being the center point of the novel. Let me ask though, did you always know that your Frank Sinatra was going to end in violence? Was this always going to be a crime novel?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I knew that was there, but in a strange way, like I knew what my interest was the relationships between these characters, but I knew that the relationships were shaped by this kind of almost like um almost like them kind of fumbling around in the aftermath of this bomb that's gone off in their
Mhm.
lives,
Yeah.
and that they're kind of like trying to see each other through the fog and the echoes of that this catastrophic events that happened to them when they were younger. So I knew that I like my main thing was about the relationships between all the characters, but I knew that the relationships was always kind of circling around the vortex of this terrible event, or many terrible events really, that happened when they were having this magical idyllic summer with a cruel underbelly.
Well, you're talking to a lot of mystery and crime fiction fans right now. That's your core group, and I think people are really excited to hear about that aspect of your craft development. And so actually Bridget in the audience had a great question, which was, what do you, Colin, love most about mystery, suspense, and darkness? Do you have favorite inspirations, or what space do you read in there?
I think like I mean, I guess like I mean I've always I think a lot of people are attracted to the kind of the dark and the sort of the kind of the subversive or the transgressive or whatever, particularly in fiction, because it's a way that you can kind of you can go to the darkness, and you can come back, if you know what I mean. Like I'm always interested in stories that modulate a lot between light and dark. So not these stories where, you can have certain books where it's a dark book, but it's just this almost like a monotony of darkness,
Hmm. Oh yeah.
this, this consistency and this sort of pile up of trauma that can almost be kind of pornographic or
Hmm.
something.
Yeah.
And there's something quite deadening and numbing to that. And it just doesn't do justice to how varied adult or just human life is, where you only have the darkness if you have the light. So it's really important to me that the work kind of balances these things. So, I would be obviously influenced a lot by a lot of noir, a lot of, film noir especially, and but also, let's just say, for example, if we were talking about I don't know, a film like a film or a novel like LA Confidential, for example, where you've got this kind of you have this propulsive story, but you have this dark underbelly of a city. But what's interesting is how all of these different people with their different loyalties and their different agendas are kind of interacting with and manipulating one another, or kind of trying to connect with one another in order to achieve whatever their goals are. But their goals are being completely shaped by the environment that they're in. And the environment is sort of almost has this octopus-like kind of, it has its tentacles around everybody and is kind of manipulating characters to its own will, if you know what I mean.
One of
So
my favorite saws talking about crime fiction is that it really comes to life when you have an incredibly specific sense of place. When you can really look at the effect that crime or malfeasance or jurisprudence has on a specific population. That specificity is really what makes the classics like LA Confidential, and a sense of place is so important in this book. I would describe the the village of Kinlock as a protagonist or an antagonist, or both. We have it's one of the big problems of the novel. It's the question of what Kinlock should be, who belongs in Kinlock, who owns Kinlock is a big question, who has fled to Kinlock, who has fled away from it. So tell me about the creation of this town, which, by the way, I looked up the actual village, so I was reading it that way. I want to hear all about how you made up the imaginary one.
yeah, it's yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted to have my own kind of town, and I mean that was influenced by everything from, like Stephen King's Derry, or like what
Yeah.
Faulkner would do, where he would fictionalize his own kind of town, his own real life town, or something like Twin Peaks, where you have this place that you can kind of when it's a place that you've created yourself, you can kind of bend it towards your own ends, your own narrative
Mhm.
ends and thematic ends. And also, you just have the freedom to, I think, render things perhaps in a more cinematic way than you might if you were just trying to do some kind of, brutal realist, something that's set in a very specific place that a lot of people will recognize.
Mhm.
So, like, just for me anyway, that was the way it kind of worked. So, I mean, I think that, one of the big influences on how I put the town together was a painting that I saw many years ago by an Austrian painter, who Sheila was his name, and he did a painting of Vienna where I think if you are familiar with Vienna, and a friend of mine is from there, so I was with him when we looked at this painting, and he said that what's interesting about the painting is that, objectively speaking, it's completely wrong. It's all of these different locations kind of collaged on top of one another and completely out of proportion to one another as
Mhm.
well. But he said, like, what the painting is, it's not a painting of Vienna out there in the world. it's a painting of all of the places that had a special resonance for Sheila. It was
Mm,
like a kind of a map of the Vienna that existed in his heart. And I think
mm,
that for me, Kinlock was kind of like I was doing a similar thing where I was kind of it was a composite of many different places that I've lived or places that I have a particular emotional association with, or
mhm,
also just a kind of so sometimes just pure fabrication for something that was right for the novel itself.
mm,
Um, but what was interesting was that I didn't actually, this is the thing that I think a lot of people overestimate how conscious you are in the decision making process when you're writing. Like, obviously when you're writing, you're making decisions all the time, but in many ways, the most fundamental elements of a book are not really things that you choose. They're it's almost like that's the way it was given to you. That's the way the idea was given to you. And for me, Kinlock was very much like that. I didn't sit down and think about creating the place. I didn't
mm.
think about maybe I need this, maybe I need that. It's more like the place was there and it was through that all of the events and all of the story emerged.
So we are talking to a largely American audience today. So from our perspective as readers, Kala has the added layer of sort of geographic intrigue and cultural fascination because it's an Irish novel.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, is it an Irish novel for you when you were writing the book? Were you writing an Irish novel? Did you have to grapple with that identity?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, like it is an Irish novel for sure. Even though, for example, the motif of like the dark underbelly of the sunny surface and then the dark underbelly is a classic kind of noir motif that I always remember the image at the beginning of Blue Velvet of the camera going down beneath the white picket fence and then all of the insects feasting on one another in the grass. And that's something that's quite universal. You have stories from every country and every continent, that will be dealing with that kind of motif. But the specifics of what happens in the book are, you know, a lot of it would be very particular to Ireland because Ireland had such as had such an idiosyncratic 20th century.
Mm,
There's this kind of cliche that kind of gets bandied about a lot that Ireland went from the 19th to the 21st century in one go.
mm,
But our 20th century was very odd because yeah, we for a Northern European country, we weren't in the process of like getting rid of an empire. We were actually like decolonizing ourselves, and forging our own kind of sense of an identity. And we didn't participate in the Second World War, and we didn't have any immigration after the Second World War, and the structure of the society wasn't so much based on a division between the left and the right politically, but it was really the church, in control of a lot of these things. And they were very rigid because the sense of identity in the country was so um, malleable or so fragile at the time because it was the country was just kind of emerging from a colonial experience. Because of that, there were very rigid parameters placed on what it was to be a legitimate member of Irish society. And if
mm,
you in any way stepped outside of them, you were very severely punished for it. And
uh,
many people, particularly women and children, were victims of that. And I guess like over the course of my lifetime, there's been such an enormous head spinning degree of social change in Ireland. Um, like in many ways, the country now would just be unrecognizable in many ways from the country that my parents grew up in. But in tandem with that, there's been this kind of very public reckoning with a lot of darkness that was going on in the country, not necessarily even you know, not even necessarily unknown to the population, because I think that's the more
yeah.
insidious thing with that. A lot of these things they were going on, and everyone both knew and didn't know that they were happening because it was safer to just avert your gaze
Mm.
from the things that were happening in the shadow.
That is um just so powerfully realized in the narratives of these characters that I mean everything you just talked about the vulnerability of women and children and the vulnerability of marginalization. And one of the big themes in this book, in a lot of noir, as I'm sure you're going to say, this is a common theme that is very provocative in all kinds of settings, but it's about money, right? We're about class. And so in Kala, we have this structural component of who is an us and who is a them, who's on the right side of the tracks or not. And so I think like the most tangible, like obvious example here is in 2003, in the teenage years, we have these high school sweethearts, Joe, who will go on to become the musician, and Kala, who are having this, torrid romance when we meet them. And then of course that romance is inflected because he's very much like a golden boy with, the universe at his feet, and she is from the wrong side of the tracks, right? And so we watch him being drawn into her charisma, and then to start to be distracted by his parents' reaction when they meet her, and they react to who she is, like who's been imprinted on her by her birth identity. And then we also see, not from Cal's perspective, but we see from the people around her, she has that charisma and this like power of maintaining a group, but actually there's so much, her self-esteem and her agency are so hard won, and they're so her self-confidence is always in question because she was born to be something less. And these things spool out in the book, and that's really powerful and intangible, like I said, but there are so many other subtler aspects of how class has inflicted itself on all of these characters, changed their lives, and changed their decision making. I actually want to talk about one of my very favorite moments in the book. When I was reading it, I had to stop and put it down, and I had to ask myself questions about myself. And if you don't mind, I'd actually love for you to read this passage to our friends here. It's on page. There's a scene that starts on page, I think, 158 in the hardcover. But so Joe, Helen, and Mush. It's in the present day. Everyone's back in Kinlock, and Joe, Helen, and Mush are going out to a bar. It's an after party to another party.
Yeah.
If you could give us that, it's just it's a 2-page scene. So yeah,
Sure,
I'd
yeah.
love, yeah.
Yeah, and so all you really need to know is that they've all learned that Kala's remains have been found, and this is the first time that they're all really together after that. And yeah, they've all been drinking quite a lot at this point. And basically they're outside a traditional music pub, and in Ireland we would just say trad for traditional music. It's just called trad. So Joe is the rock star, and he's going over to join Helen and Mush, who are already outside having a drink and having a cigarette outside. So here we go. Sky's gone grey over the small car park, and you push through the smokers. Helen's alone, sitting on a stone wall. You keep close to Mush, making sure he stays between you and Helen. She's barely looked at you tonight. You can tell she's drunk from the swim of her eyes as she tries some of Mush's pint. Mush is sweating. You should take a look inside there, Helen. The music's amazing. Are you serious? She says. Trad. A few of the Flanagan's crowd are lingering nearby, smoking, pretending not to listen. Adjust how you're sitting. They'll all remember the night they saw Joe Brennan out drinking in Kinlock like an ordinary guy. Two blondes, psyching each other up to approach you. One of them puts a hand on your arm. The usual script. Huge fans. Been listening to your stuff for, oh my god, years. American accent, English learned as a second language, Scandinavian, Greek. Fuck it, they could be from anywhere. Did you grow up playing this sort of traditional music? One of them says. We don't have this where we are from, the other says. It must make you proud. You've had this conversation so many times, it's autopilot. This music's who we are, you say. It's in our blood. Helen snorts into her pint. What? You say. You don't like trad? No, she laughs. And neither do you. Or has it become cool now? Ah, now, Mush says. Listen to them fiddles, Helen. Where's your pride? Reactionary kitsch, Helen says. You frown. It's authentic. Romantic. There's a reason romantics always end up as fascists, Helen says. Appeals to authenticity are always rooted in essentialist thinking. She hasn't changed. One of the blondes touches your newest tattoo. In a quiet voice, she says, I think it's so beautiful. Sentimental dog shit, Helen mutters. Mush nudges her. Nothing wrong with that every now and then, Helen. Bit of emotion. Sentimentality is for people who want the luxury of an emotion without paying any price for it. Oh, that's clever, Helen, you say. That's Oscar Wilde, Joe. Terrible to be cynical. I'm cynical, she says. This country invents a fake past, packages it for tourists as a product, and then cons itself into believing that somehow it's all real. When the reality of this place, this is Helen, you say to the blondes. She used to be fairly intense, but she's really mellowed out over the reality of this place, Helen says, leaning forward, is that people here will turn a blind eye to every sort of horror for the sake of a quiet life. And this is the music they use to tell themselves stories about how, actually, they're the great victims of history, when the truth is, Helen, Mush says, I mean, the hypocrisy, she says, frowning into your pint over some cliched shit about the brutal Brits, congratulating yourself for your innocence, squeezing out a few cheap tears before staggering home to beat the wife. Jesus, Helen, take it easy, Mush says. I hate this music, and I hate this place, Helen says. How can a country so self-absorbed never even come close to actual introspection? Helen, Mush drones playfully. Helen! Mush gets her in a headlock and she starts to punch him in the side. They squabble like that, like siblings, rolling over on their sides. Helen starts laughing. Helen! Mush shouts. The blondes are bewildered, more flustered by the happy violence between Helen and Mush than anything Helen has said. Teresa's sending you screenshots of the selfies people are uploading with you on Instagram. You're wearing the same smile in each one, a drink in hand. Should never have told her you were on the dry tonight.
Thank you so much. I First of all, I love hearing you read. That's fantastic. But I love that scene. I had to stop and ask myself that Helen's point. I don't want to disagree with anything she says. I want to believe in progress, and I want to believe in change and the betterment of humanity. But I'm a person who loves traditional music. I think there's a lot of us Americans who have some kind of Celtic roots, who maybe grew up with Irish or Scottish
Sure.
folk, and we're taught that this is what our people had to leave behind, and we have a sense of pride in it, and I just love that. That where did that come from? Do you want to talk about your own personal relationship to trad music, or should we leave that between the lines?
No, I mean I've a lot of time for I have a lot of time for trad music. The thing is that like I think that that scene, for example, would be it's a good example of the way that the the characters, everything that they're saying is actually really being informed by this very ambivalent relationship they have to home, to the
Yeah.
idea of home.
Mhm.
Because for Joe, his whole thing about coming back to Kinlock is this sort of it's this real effort to reconnect with something that he feels is more real or more true than the life that he's grown into as a famous person. And so for him, it's sort of like this combination of like the small town boy made good, returning home, and this kind of victory lap and a reconnection to something that might kind of anchor him in the more vital, more vulnerable energies of his youth.
Mm,
Ellen, it's like the complete opposite. It's like this is a place that it torments me, it haunts me. It's a place that I've done everything in my adult life to get away from,
yeah.
and being back here, the thing with Helen is that she can be very abrasive, but she's abrasive because she's on the defense, from the get-go. From the moment she arrives in the town, her whole modus operandi is this place is not going to get to me. This is not going to touch me, and she can be very sharp-elbowed in doing that, in defending herself, because in many ways she's grown into someone who is kind of suffocating beneath her own emotional armor.
Mm,
But a lot of the time this is something that a character like Mush would be more perceptive of. And you can see that Mush's kind of general approach in that thing, while Helen and Joe are having their own kind of conflict with each other, Mush is always just trying to kind of keep the peace and just like
mm,
everything's okay, let's just get along kind of thing. A much more kind of earthed relationship than to the place than they
mhm.
have. So I think that's one of the things that like a lot of the time when they're talking about one thing, like when they're talking about trad, they're not really talking about the trad even. Like they're talking about something much more deeper, like emotionally for themselves. And the trad is just like the instrument that they're using to beat each other over the head, at that particular moment in time.
This actually brings me, there's an audience member, Temperance, who had a great question about if any of the characters were drawn from people you actually know. And she specifically wanted to know about Mush. But I echo her question, and I specifically want to know about Helen, because Helen really, really spoke to me.
Um, no, like Helen was the first. She was the first narrative voice that came to me, and but she wasn't. She wasn't based on any. Like none of the characters are based on a specific individual at all. Um, you can tell. Like sometimes you can certain motifs might come from someone that you would have known or an experience you had, but they're not they're not drawn from or based on any particular individuals at all, they really kind of came to me quite like well formed, and in that kind of weird way where, like with Helen, for example, when she was the first character that kind of came to me. And for me at the beginning, because when I started writing Helen, it was the teenage Helen. So when she's 14 and she moves to Kinlock for the first time, and she's the new girl in the new town, and she's got this kind of fraught relationship with her father and her sister, and she's very lonely, and I could feel the sense of vulnerability that she had, and it was like
Mm,
her strength was like this kind of this flickering light, this flickering flame that she carried inside herself, and she felt very fragile to me. And then as I was writing, I was kind of it really surprised me just how abrasive she could be in defending that little flickering light that she had inside herself. It was like she had to just, yeah, barricade herself in so much emotional armor in order to stop herself being hurt, because she's already carrying a lot of hurt by the time she's a 14-year-old girl, for reasons that become clear as the book goes on. And by the time she's an adult, that's just gotten even worse because of the events that happen when they're teenagers. So, but that was the kind of thing where, like, she surprised me in that respect. And in a weird way, that's when you know you have something, when the characters start to kind of push back against what you think they are, what you think they should be doing. It's like once you begin to feel like there's something on the page that's pushing back against you, it can be very frustrating when you think you've solved a problem and then the thing just won't accept your great solution. But it's also very galvanizing, because it's
yeah,
like, all right, I do have something here. I just
it's
need
alive.
it's alive. Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So we had a lot of people in the audience now are curious about your journey as a writer. They would like to know what inspired you to get started. How do you keep going? How did you first get published? What's your writing story?
Like basically, I mean, I hadn't been writing. I didn't study creative writing. I didn't do like an MFA or anything like that. And I was studying philosophy actually. And then I was going to pursue that, and then and because I was studying philosophy very intensively, so that meant that I actually hadn't read any fiction for many years. I'd been reading a lot of history and a lot of theory and a lot of abstract kind of things like that. And then, like, one Christmas, I read the novel A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, and that novel just blew the top of my head off, and it was just like oh my God, like everything that I want, and are all the things that I can't get to with what I'm doing at the moment in my life, is like it's happening in this form,
Hmm.
where you're taking all of the complications and knottiness of human experience, but you're not trying to kind of resolve them or dissolve the contradictions of life in some kind of metaphysical architecture. You're just dramatizing them, and you're dramatizing the tensions of these things, and looking at things not as problems, but as like not as problems in the sense that like not as something that has a solution, but just
Mm,
as dilemmas, which is
mm.
like the human condition, you
Yeah,
know. And
yeah.
I was like, this is what I want to be doing. So I turned down. I was supposed to go to the States, in fact, to do a PhD, and I turned it down and immediately like was in a lot of financial trouble because I had no money left from my studies, and going to do a PhD was a way also to just have some money. So I spent a long time just kind of, yeah, cobbling like the rent together month by month while I was teaching myself how to write. And I mainly did that because I didn't study it formally. I mainly did it from listening to interviews with writers or reading interviews with writers. If I found a book that I really liked, I would read every interview that I could get my hands on with the writer about that book. And you'd learn a lot about their techniques and their decision making behind certain processes. And then inevitably they would mention writers or novels that influenced them in the writing of that book. And then I would kind of go there and repeat the process. I would read their books, and if I really liked it, I would like delve into that and learn everything about how they constructed it. And through that, I kind of collaged together a sort of curriculum, an ad hoc curriculum, following my own appetites as a reader, I guess. And then, yeah, I started writing short stories, and I won a few prizes with short stories. And through that, I got an agent, and just through winning the prizes. And by then, I'd already begun what would become Kala. And the first time that I met my agent in person, she was talking about, so we should think about putting together a collection of your stories. And are you working on anything else? And I kind of gave her the sort of the basic pitch of like what Kala was. And I and I really remember, like, as I kind of was speaking, I remember like the just like her eyes kind of, it was like the shutter of a camera going off behind her eyes or something as I was talking, and her whole demeanor kind of shifted, and she was like, okay, forget about the story collection. This is the thing now. This is what you need to just like devote all of your energy to this. This is the thing. And that's what I did. And so I was doing that, just I was working a full-time job and just getting up very early in the morning, writing in the evenings, writing on the weekends, and then eventually, it was ready to send out to publishers, and that was the beginning of that.
Have you told Marlon James this story?
No, I'd love to meet him, because
I think you should write Marlon James a letter, and you should say, I dropped out of my philosophy PhD program and became a writer because of you. If I were Marlon James, I'd want to hear
uh,
that.
yeah, I mean, like I mean, it is that thing where people use phrases like, that book changed my life or whatever, but
Yeah,
literally, like
it did.
he really
Yeah.
did, and it's like it's such an amazing book, it's just such an amazing book, and yeah, I'd love to meet him sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So lots of audience members have asked specific questions about your craft and process. I'll throw a couple at you and you can address them as you like. So
Sure. Yeah,
Jacques
yeah.
would like to know, how do you organize your thoughts when you start the novel? Lori asks, what does your writing schedule particularly look like? You've told us you write in the morning, but I'd like specifics there. Michael asks, how much time do you spend on research and then later on fact checking? And Helen asks, did you know from the beginning that the book was how it was going to end? And also, was your writing process chronological? Just tell us about any of those things.
Yeah, I mean, like I think the thing with process, it's I think the thing is that for me at least anyway, but I think it would be true from a lot of people, is your process changes depending on what stage you are at with a project.
Mm,
So if you're at the very beginning of something, you have to be very, and I say this as someone who's very bad at doing this, but you have to be very generous with yourself, because and anybody who writes, anyone who writes will kind of laugh at that idea of being generous with yourself, because so much of writing is just about kind of sitting alone in a room being like, oh, just thinking that you're the worst person in the world, or that everything you're doing is terrible. But you have to be really generous with yourself at the beginning, because that old cliche of like, you're making a statue out of a block of marble, but like at the beginning you don't even have any marble. You have to like just generate the block of marble first. And
Mm.
that is a long, tedious geological process.
It takes
And
millions of years.
yeah, it does, like it feels like that anyway. And you have to kind of give yourself that permission to kind of for it to be very muddy and slow, and you don't really know what you have, and you take one step forward and then like four steps back with something, and it's all kind of notes that you're writing, in your phone, or scribbling down on the back of like train tickets, and then kind of cobbling together in a Word document. And but gradually, like those kind of fragments begin to kind of, if things are going well, certain kind of things begin to kind of resonate between these different things that you have going on, or or there was a very good book I read a while ago, which talked, it was about all these revolutions that happened in Europe in 1848. But he talks about how at a certain stage these revolutions started happening randomly all over the place, but there was no causal relationship between them. It was, he calls it the fission stage, the nuclear fission
Mm,
stage. All these things just start to go like pop, 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 pop all over. And
mm,
after a while, if you're kind of slowly pushing the boulder of your ideas, eventually, suddenly, all these things that seem completely unconnected begin to kind of pop off one another and generate more and more stuff. And then then you've got the ball rolling.
yeah.
But then, you still can't. At that stage, you can only work in small. You are like I can only work in small increments because you don't have enough material to sustain you for writing for 6 hours straight. At that point, you're still cobbling together kind of elements. But once you do know what you have, once I knew what I had with Kala, and I kind of had my arms a bit wrapped around it, then I could happily work like 10 hours a
Mm,
day, because I knew what I was doing, and I, even if I was getting stuck, I knew what I was getting stuck in, if you know what I mean. Um, but that's the thing, is that if you sit down with nothing and expect that, okay, if I do this now for 8 hours a day, I'll have something at the end. You're kind of setting yourself up for not just for failure, but also for feeling really bad about yourself, which isn't going to help with the work. You have to you have to almost like trick yourself into not kind of getting stuck in that thing of feeling like you're not achieving anything, because yeah, it has to be slow before it's fast, but like I'd say the first 60 pages of Kala took me longer to write than everything else, than everything else. It was like the book is like more than 400 pages long. First 60 pages took, years. And then the rest of the book, it was a matter of months, because by that stage I had worked out the grammar of the book.
I feel very validated right now. I've written two books in my life, and in both cases, the beginning was the last part that I was able to write. It was so hard to do the beginning.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Because it's like you're literally like, you can't draw a map for like territory that you haven't even entered,
Yeah,
and you've fenced the
right.
territory too.
So good. So a
Yeah.
really good point. So we are just about, it's time for us to close, but I have two really good, quick audience questions that I'd like to close with. First is from Jessica, my favorite questions of all time. What, Colin, is the best piece of advice that you've ever received? Jessica didn't specify whether or not it's writing advice, so you can take the question
No,
as you
I
like.
would say that like the one piece of writing advice that I heard, that always comes back to me, and I think it's an important thing, is that you should never be ashamed of your process. Whatever
Mm,
it is, whatever it is that works. And if you are changing your process throughout a project, yeah, good. That's great. Like, I mean, just whatever works. I think like there's people tend to fetishize like routines, and if I emulate the routine of this writer that I admire, then I'll produce their type of work. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. It's just you have to just find what works for you,
mm,
and don't be ashamed of it, because what actually, like, the process isn't what ultimately matters. What matters is the work that comes out at the end. So you just have to go with what's actually helping you get the work on the page, and don't be ashamed about it at all. And that's something I come back to again and again.
I love that. It's so easy to be self-conscious about your practice, especially as you were saying in the beginning, when it's so inchoate and you don't know where you're going.
Yeah.
You're wandering in the dark, and it is so easy to just have this self-shame. Don't throw that away. I love that. Okay, so very, very last question. Is there anything you read lately, old or new, that you would just love to share with some of your fans here?
Um, I recently read a novel that it really came and went a few years ago by an English writer named Susie Boyt, Boyt, and it I didn't even hear about it when it came out at all. It's called Loved and Missed, Missed,
Hmm.
and it's about the relationship between yeah, a woman whose her daughter is a drug addict, and she has a daughter of her own, and this woman decides that she's going to take the granddaughter and raise her and kind of, do everything right this time. And
Hmm.
it's about the kind of relationship between them. And I read it like a few months ago. I hadn't heard anything about it, and I was really like, this is one of the best books I've read in 10 years. It's really like an unbelievably good book, and I think it was just recently published in the States. But it's like, it's again, it got no attention, you know.
Hmm.
It was
Loved
really,
and Missed, everyone, by Susie
I loved
Boyce.
it. I loved it. One of the most like emotionally acute, like every page, it's just unbelievable. There's just so many insights flashing up at you all the time. I really, really, really loved it, and I couldn't recommend it highly enough. I mean, it's tough. It's very tough, but it's beautiful too.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for coming today. It's been lovely spending this hour with you. I just want to remind everyone that this beautiful book is the Barnes and Noble monthly pick for July. Wait, show yours. Is it the same? Oh, yeah,
same.
yeah,
It's the same
yeah.
as you. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for attending today. This has been my absolute privilege. Fantastic to talk to you, Colin. Thanks for being
Yeah,
here.
thank you all, and thank you so much as well, Juliet. I really, really appreciate that, Juliet. It was really good, and thanks for being so generous with your questions, and thanks so much to everyone for attending. And yeah, if you read the book, I hope you enjoy your time with the Kinlock crew. Yeah, cool. Thank you. See ya. Bye bye.